25 years ago, something called the Northwest Forest Plan was put in place. It protected more than 24 million acres of forest in Northern California, Oregon, and Washington. On the anniversary of that law, the debate over what to do with America's ancient forests has come under new scrutiny. Who should be in charge of the future? Industry or environmentalists? We travel deep into the forest and above it, looking for answers as part of our continuing series, Eye on Earth.
November 2122 Sierra, runway 2, clear for takeoff.
Our trip began in a small plane, maybe the best way to see what's happening in western Oregon.
You can see where there's a few trees left here and there. That's required by Oregon law.
Our guide, Chandra Legue of the group Oregon Wild.
So we're actually really in the heart of some serious logging right now.
The views from overhead can be jarring. Mountains teeming with towering trees, followed by winding cutouts of nothing but stumps. This is what modern-day clear-cutting looks like. Giant machines handle massive trees like matchsticks. This land has never been logged.
No, it hasn't.
This is a place where none of that has happened, a so-called old-growth forest.
We only have about 15% of the forest that once grew trees like this that are left.
Areas like this were protected by the Northwest Forest Plan, which was signed in 1994 and impacted more than 24 million acres of federal land in Oregon, California, and Washington.
Was the Northwest Forest Plan a success or failure?
From an environmental perspective, it's a success, but we're only 25 years in. It's kind of a long-term experiment.
Logging on federal lands has dropped by as much as 90%. But on state-owned and private land, time-lapse of satellite images over Northwest Oregon give a sense of just how common clear-cutting still is. Legue says it has a lasting impact. Forests capture carbon, helping to cool the earth and slow climate change. Logging companies are required by law to replant new trees after clear cuts. But it can take a decade or more before a young forest absorbs as much carbon as an old one. Not every company like yours is willing to talk about their story or take us to places like this. Why do you do that?
I think we as an industry have not done a very good job historically of telling our story.
Todd Payne is the CEO of Seneca Jones, a timber giant in western Oregon.
Has the Northwest Forest Plan been a success or failure in your estimation?
Honestly speaking, I think it was a failure.
Payne believes the Northwest Forest Plan is choking growth, and the hands-off approach environmentalists advocate is leading to more wildfires because forests have been neglected. He took us to one of Seneca's expansive tree farms an hour and a half outside Eugene, where they operate on 50-year cycles. This area next to us was clear-cut about 55 years ago for the first time, and then clear-cut again 3 or 4 years ago.
3 years ago, correct.
Why clear-cut?
We're mimicking what Mother Nature's done for billions of years.
But this looks traumatic for a lot of people when they see something like this.
I actually look at it quite different. I think it's somewhat aesthetically pleasing.
You think that looks aesthetically pleasing?
I do. And maybe it's somewhat biased, but I look at this and I see sustainability, rejuvenation.
Timber companies have also traditionally used a practice called aerial spraying. Chemicals dropped via helicopter to kill any vegetation other than trees used for lumber. A lot of people are concerned about the spraying.
Well, I think people are just not informed well on that subject. We use it once or twice in a 50-year cycle.
It ultimately flows somewhere, though.
No, it doesn't. You know, a lot of times this stuff doesn't flow off the landscape. The product will adhere to the vegetation that it's targeted for and stay there.
Nancy Webster, who lives up the coast in Rockaway Beach, Oregon, is worried those chemicals seep into her drinking water. The fight between environmentalists and logging companies is not new, but this seems like the newest chapter.
Right. This affects the fish, the wildlife, and we are up against large corporations, and to even counter it, you need science and legal help, and it's really difficult for small communities.
Today, the situation may be reaching a critical point because the federal government wants to suspend a public review process, which logging companies say needlessly ties them up in court.
Should there be a public review process when logging takes place on public lands?
Well, we have professionals in place in our federal agencies that are managing these lands, and I think we need to let them do that work.
In other words, he wants groups like Oregon Wild to stay away.
The argument is from them that if they're not able to log, people can't build homes.
Yeah, well, no one's talking about shutting down logging. We're talking about what I feel are common sense changes that do less damage to the environment that we all share.
LeGue wants to see forests thin, not clear-cut, a far less invasive approach. Though she acknowledges it is more expensive and would produce less lumber.
I think people do need to come to grips with the fact that the wood that they use to build houses or anything else comes from clear-cutting forests in places like Oregon.
So what you're saying is there's a price to pay for a better world.
I think in order to make amends in some way, that there is a price to pay for that. And I think it's worth it.
The global demand for wood over the next 10 years is expected to increase 33%. So the question is where that lumber comes from, or if it comes from somewhere. The timber industry would argue that whatever impact their practices may have, it's less than what it is to use concrete or steel and the imprint that has globally as we move forward.
Or I would imagine glass, as in our skyscrapers here in New York City.
Well, and it's amazing when you look at it, it's compromise. Somewhere you gotta find a middle ground between both these sides.